Okay, everybody, we are at the last chapter in the term. We are going to be talking about families today, and it is important to note that family is really the most basic social institution in any society, and it was the first institution, the first any institution in society in our history. Before there were city states, before there were nation states, before there were empires, there were families. And laws often revolved around kinship ties and kinship systems and kinship government forms. Um, you could not survive as an individual in pre modern times. You always needed to have a family. They provided the material resources you needed to survive, all the way from hunter and gatherer days to the agricultural days. And even today, it's hard to survive in this world as an individual. You usually need other people to help you sustain your material needs. But especially in pre modern times, in a hunter and gatherer history, we needed other people to protect us from wild animals, to protect us from invaders, to protect us against the elements, to help grow and collect food, to help construct shelter, to help construct clothing. And so families have always been the most elemental form of any human society. One of the things that we're going to talk about today is that how we form families is very different in reality than what most people think. Most people believe that they have unlimited choice in whom they select to be their partner and then to perhaps have a family out of that romantic partnership. We're going to talk about how there are many social forces and social processes that really narrow and filter out who our potential partners will be. But let's talk about these family forms that I'm sure all of you have heard of. Um, it's important to note that the nuclear family has not been the most common type of family in our human history. And even today, the nuclear family is fraying in a lot of ways, but mostly in ways that people misunderstand. A nuclear family is considered the traditional family, even though traditionally this was not the most common type of family. Okay, and it's not the most common type of family in many other societies today. So the term nuclear comes from the Greek term nuclei, which means the core family, which are the parents and then their offspring. So two generations. But the nuclear family, in the way we see it today, is much more of the product of industrial growth and urbanization, because that allowed for a level of financial independence and affluence that sustains families today. That is being challenged during economic hardships, and historically, it wasn't possible just to have one generation bringing in the bacon, so to speak. It wasn't possible to just have one generation providing for the economic and financial needs of an entire household. In most traditional societies, we had multi-generational or extended families. And it wasn't just the grandparents, because and oftentimes, we had high mortality rates. So grandparents may not even be in the picture, but you had extended families more so in the sense of having a cousin or cousins or uncles or aunts living with the parents of said children. Okay, you also had non-blood people, in households. Even in the early American colonies, most households were not arranged with just the parents and the children. They often had neighbors that would live in the home to help on a farm. You had hired hands or boarders that would rent a room or rent a space in the for lodging in the structure, so that the family could survive. Um, this was only possible again amongst the wealthiest families to have just one generation sustaining the economic and financial lifeboat, of that family. Um, One thing that I will say too that I think is very interesting is that children today are more likely to grow up with their grandparents alive than they were likely to grow up with their parents 100 years ago. And so families today might seem very fragile. Families today might seem very unstable, but in many ways, they are more stable than at any other time in human history, just because fewer and fewer people are dying. Mortality rates are extremely low now in comparison to previous centuries. Um, Children would often, by the time they were in their teens, their parents would already be dead. They would already be passed away. So kids grew up very quickly, and centuries passed. They became adults very quickly. We tend to think that kids become adults too quickly today. There was no sense of childhood 150 years ago. Kids were not seen as these special creatures that had to be loved and nourished, and they were seen as little adults that were put to work by the time they were 6 years old. Okay, so extended families are becoming more common in the U.S. again today as a result of financial constraints. You have parents that are moving in with their parents, or the grandparents are moving in with their kids. Um, you have aunts and uncles moving in with a nuclear family. You have sisters or brothers who decide to live together to save on rent, to save on expenses. So extended families are becoming more common again in the United States. And another reason they're becoming more common is the growth of immigration from Latin America and from Asia. Immigrants are more likely to live in extended families, from grandparents to the grandchildren, than are native born American families. So I hope this all makes sense. This leads to the next slide with that there is really no typical family in Western societies today. We're kind of going back to the future where extended families are becoming more common again, just like they were in the past. Um, Families can consist of step siblings, half siblings. There are many single parent families today. However, there were more single parent families 100 years ago than there are today because of very high mortality rates. Okay? We tend to forget how much medicine has improved in the last century. So again, like I said, today there are actually fewer single parent families than there were 100 years ago. Now, the reason for single parenthood has changed. There are more divorces than there were 100 years ago. Okay? But again, these things have shifted, but the result has largely been the same for children. You also have a growing number of individuals and couples who are choosing not to get married and not to have children. And we're going to talk more about this later. More about this in a second, or in a few minutes. These are two terms that you probably haven't heard of. These are the terms endogamy and exogamy are important social structures, important social processes that really filter out potential mates, potential partners. So endogamy refers to marriage to someone within one's social group. And again, we Americans tend to think that we have unlimited choice, that we are individuals, that we have freedom of choice and everything. And that's something that Americans have a hard time not accepting, that, oh, well, maybe our choices are structured by society. So if you think about it, and we see this in statistics, most people who are white marry other white people. Most people who are black marry other black people. Most people who are middle class marry other middle class people. Most college graduates marry other college graduates. Most people from New York marry other people in New York. Most people from Tennessee marry other people from Tennessee. Most people from the United States marry other Americans. Most Christians marry other Christians. Most Jews marry other Jews. This is what I mean in terms of endogamy. We marry people that are similar to us as far as our social groups. So really, and we didn't even talk about age. Most people marry someone of the same age or within 5 years, plus or minus our age. And so if you think about it, we filter out through endogamous structures 95% of potential people whom we marry, right? So we kind of want this. We kind of want to be filtered out because that helps us select. We want to be filtering out people because that helps us select people who are more like us, who are more similar to us. So endogamy is a very powerful structure that influences us, that instructs our choices, that limits our choices, that but also facilitates us meeting people who share social characteristics that might lead to more amiable relationships in the long run. So exogamy is increasing in some respects. Interreligious marriages are increasing. So you have more people who are Jewish marrying Christians. You have more Christians who might marry Hindus, because since there's larger numbers of Indian immigrants coming from Asia. Although that is quite small. You have a greater level of interethnic marriage between, say, white people and Asian people, or white people and Hispanic people. But exogamy isn't really growing as far as black and white marriages. Interracial marriage between white people and black people has always been very low, and it continues to be very low. So even though exogamy is increasing amongst ethnicity and amongst religion, it's actually shrinking as far as education and social class. In the 70s, you were much more likely to see someone having a high school education marrying someone with a college education, or even someone who was a high school dropout married someone with a college education. Usually the high school dropout was a man who could still make a lot of money working in a factory. But today, these middle class jobs with no education are very rare. And so you're increasingly seeing other college graduates marrying other college graduates, other wealthy people marrying other wealthy people, and because the economy has changed. We actually, of course, had laws against interracial marriage that we talked about during the race unit. Loving versus Virginia was the Supreme Court decision that struck down the anti-miscegenation laws, laws that said interracial couples could not marry. You had many, many states, even until the late 60s, who banned interracial marriage. Public opinion didn't shift, however, until the 1990s. As recently ago as 1990, a majority of Americans believed that interracial marriage wasn't proper. So even though the laws changed, it took more than 20 years for the culture to kind of catch up. The same is true with same-sex marriage today. The laws changed. Well, it was kind of simultaneous. The culture changed and the laws changed, but you still have 40% of the American population that doesn't agree with same-sex marriage. The culture changes fast. Culture changes slower than laws in many instances. These terms, too, I'm sure you've all heard of before: monogamy and polygamy. Monogamy is the practice of marrying or being in a relationship with one person at a time, having a sexual, romantic, and affectionate relationship with one person at the same, just one person at a time. We don't really have monogamy in this society. We have what is more likely to be called serial monogamy. It's not as if you are just with one person your entire life. You have an exclusive romantic and sexual relationship just with one person in your entire life. We tend to have a series of monogamous relationships. So over time. So the typical American may have like 6 or 7 monogamous relationships over their lifetime. And of course, even though in theory this is a monogamous relationship, people tell social researchers that they have engaged in extramarital affairs And about 30% of Americans will tell survey researchers that they have engaged in extramarital affairs. Monogamy, believe it or not, is something that has become more um, venerated and than in years past. We value monogamy more than we did 50 years ago, according to our research. 50 years ago, it was much more socially acceptable for men to have extramarital affairs. It was something that was just more accepted by society. Women obviously could not have extramarital affairs, but men could have extramarital affairs. And it wasn't seen as a good thing, but it was almost kind of normalized. People were not surprised. And it shows the power of a patriarchal culture that males' extramarital affairs could be tolerated, but women's would not at all be tolerated. The more value of monogamy today in marriages shows the power that women have today. Um, that they are more equal in their marriages, that they are more equal in their relationships, that they will not put up with that, even though they were sort of forced to put up with that in the past. So egalitarian marriage has actually become more favorable to monogamy. Polygamy is a system of marriage where you're married to more than one spouse at a time. Believe it or not, this is actually much more likely to be traditional marriage than monogamy. Um, in most societies, at most historical time periods, it was legal for a man to marry more than one woman. And it is still legal in many societies and countries today in Asia and in Africa. And it tends to be more than one woman and one man. Okay? Polygamy is most seen in polygyny, a system of marriage that allows men to have multiple wives. And in these societies and cultures, to have multiple wives is a form of status. Having more than one wife shows that you have the economic resources to support more than one wife. So it's a form of social status to have multiple wives. What is also what we see is polyandry, but we see this in societies that have more resource scarcity. This is a system of marriage that allows women to have multiple husbands. But this is very rare. It's more likely to occur in very poor herding societies or agrarian societies where there's a limit of land, where households cannot just form, where new households cannot just form easily and then to acquire plots of land or to acquire property. So you might have two brothers marrying one woman or two male cousins marrying one woman because they have to share property, they have to share a plot of land. So this is only common in very isolated rural areas where there's still a herding culture, a horticultural society, or agricultural society. We also have cohabitation. So this is misunderstood, though, in the US. I think it's important to take a historical outlook, to take a historical perspective on cohabitation. About 8% of American households are cohabiting households. This means that you live together without being married. And it usually involves a romantic or sexual relationship, right? And until the 1980s, cohabitation was heavily stigmatized in the US. It was quote unquote living in sin or shacking up. This has changed considerably. 90% of people who get married first cohabited with their partner prior to marriage. This includes very conservative religious people. So cohabitation is becoming a norm now, cohabiting before getting married. But only 8% of all households are cohabiting at any one given point in time. And that's why that might seem a little bit low for you, because I'm sure all of you know people who have cohabited before getting married. But the reason why it's only 8% at any one given time is that most cohabitations are very brief, because most cohabitations either then become marriages, people take the next step and get married, or the relationship ends, the relationship dissolves, the people break up. But it's important to note that cohabitation was very common historically. Marriage through cohabitation or common law marriage was the predominant form of marriage in Europe well into the 18th century. Um, the secret here is that the church and the state, and the church and the state were the same, of course, in Europe as they were in many other parts of the world. There was no separation of the secular and the religious. The church didn't care about marriage unless you were wealthy. The church didn't care about marriage unless you had assets. The church didn't care about marriage unless you had inheritance that you could pass down to offspring. So marriage was very revered and esteemed and celebrated, and you had huge weddings for the aristocracy and for landowners and for the kind of the bourgeois in those European societies. But if you were working class, if you were poor, if you were a peasant, which was 95% of all people in early modern Europe, then you didn't have any assets, you didn't have a household, you didn't have land, you didn't have property. You were a tenant. And so the church and the state couldn't tax you that way. You were taxed in other forms, but you didn't pay income, you didn't pay property taxes, you didn't pay estate taxes. So the church and the state really didn't care that much about you. And if you did have a marriage, it was very informal, where you would have you wouldn't have a priest or a pastor marry you if you were a commoner. You would simply have more of a local townsman marry you, like a red type of someone who's today seen as kind of like a registrar, would marry you, and it'd be a very simple ceremony where you would have just a few guests, and you would just have one witness, and the witness would just verify that you were not already married. So marriages were, when they did occur for the commoners, were very low key. They were very informal, very small, because most people didn't have any money. And even when if you did have a ceremony, or I'm sorry, for most people didn't even have a ceremony. They just lived together. Okay, and eventually they came to be seen as married by the authorities. That's what common law marriage is. So it's important to note too that our ideas of the family and our ideas of marriage have shifted considerably, and that what we think of as the traditional family, what we think of as the traditional nuclear family, what we think of as traditional marriage is not at all what has actually been historically present. In pre-industrial families, you had to just survive, okay? Marriage was seen as an economic institution. It was seen as an economic contract. It was seen as an economic partnership. Everybody in the home had to work for the survival of that household. Children over the age of 6 worked, mothers worked, women worked, fathers worked. And again, you didn't really have a nuclear family. You had cousins, aunts, uncles, maybe the grandparents if they were still alive. You took in renters or boarders to help on the farm. So home was a site of work and family life. There was no separation between work and home. The home unit was the work unit, was the economic unit. If you were in a rural area in the country, like most people were farmers, or if you were in a city and had a shop, or if you were an artisan, if you were a metal worker, you had a shop on the main level, and upstairs was your house. So there was never any separation of work and family life. And everyone worked, including the children. Okay? So early modern families depended heavily on kinship networks, which are systems of relationships between people related by blood and marriages. And so throughout almost all of our human history, people never left their kinship networks. They always had family members around them, relatives, cousins, uncles. You didn't travel more than 6 miles radius of your home because that was about how much you could walk in a day. I mean, we didn't have modern transportation. And so people never really left their homesteads very often. People didn't travel to distant cities, to distant places. We were very limited. And so you ended up partnering up with someone who was maybe even your second cousin because you didn't have a lot of non-blood relations living around you, but you were usually um, you partnered up with somebody who you believed and whom your family believed was reliable, like a good worker, honest, and then you got married, perhaps, but it wasn't out of love or sexual attraction. Now, if that developed later on in the relationship, more power to you. But love and romantic love and sexual attraction was not the basis of marriage. The basis of marriage was this person lived by you, you could get along with them, they were a good worker, they were dependable, they came from a decent family, and so you partnered up with them. So these kinship networks and kinship control over marriage weakened during the Industrial Revolution, where you had, for the first time in human history, large numbers of people migrating to cities where they worked in factories, where they worked in mills. They, for the first time, met other people who were not their blood relations. This is the first time people really had friends that were not blood relations, because you moved away from your parents, you moved away from your kinship groups, you met people independent of your family, and so your family then had less control over you. So when you moved to cities, worked in factories, you ended up meeting strangers for the first time in large numbers. And this is where we get the idea of friendship and where you get the idea of romantic love partnerships and romantic love marriages, where you would marry someone whom you still thought would, be reliable, but you were sexually attracted to them, emotionally attracted to them. You had this romantic relationship prior to getting married. And so romantic based marriages were not common until the industrial period in the 17th and 18th centuries. Another interesting fact is that the Industrial Revolution started to create this division between work life and home life. And um, this is important because we always think of the traditional family as the man goes out to work, the wife, the mother stays at home. This has not been the case historically about what has happened. As I just stated, every family member in the family unit had to work to sustain an economic and financial well-being of the family, including the children. Um, Starting in the 1850s, with the growth of cities, the growth of capitalism, the growth of capitalism and industry, you had men that went off to work in offices and made middle class wages and sustained upper middle class families. And those women, true, did not quote unquote work. Okay, they didn't work for income. They didn't work for wages. They still did work with the kids at home, but they didn't go out and sell their labor for wages. But this was a very, very small fraction of the population. Poor white women, African American women, Hispanic women, other immigrants always had to work. They were never just stay at home moms, they were never just homemakers. Okay? So the traditional family is not what we think of it is. It is not this timeless universal concept. It developed in response to very specific conditions in which more people were able to have middle class lifestyles following the Second World War. You had an economic boom after the war because of pent up consumer demand, because of high levels of industry that had not been automated or left the United States by that time. You also had high levels of unionization that supported family wages, where some people could support an entire family on one income, but that still was mostly reserved for middle class people of European descent. Okay, and even most white families could not follow this traditional nuclear family with the male breadwinner and the stay-at-home mom who was the homemaker. Most women still had to work. White women, white working class women, long worked in laundries, in textile mills, in factories. Black women obviously were first slaves, then they were sharecroppers, tenant farmers. Black women, when they gained their freedom from slave masters, worked as really caretakers. They worked as domestics, as maids. Um, then they started to work more like in retail and agricultural work in factories. Hispanic women worked historically in fields and agricultural work, and then into other types of factories like meat packing, then in healthcare, home health aides, and again the same for white women. So women, unless they were upper middle class or affluent, always had to work to survive, to help their families survive financially. The stay-at-home mom was a luxury only for upper middle class urban women. Okay, but because of the power, right? It's hegemony, the power of the culture of the upper class that filters down to the consciousness of the mainstream. This is why this idea of the stay-at-home mother became the dominant and preferred family form. And if you didn't live up to this, there was something wrong with you. Okay, so that's important to note. Um, in the 1960s, this is when things began to shift dramatically for families. Divorce rates peaked in the 1980s. Divorce rates increased substantially during the decade of the 1970s. Now, it increased substantially for two very important reasons. One was that the laws were changed, so that by the 1970s you had the onset of no fault divorce. What no fault divorce means is that you didn't have to have someone who was at fault or to blame for why the marriage didn't work. Until the 70s in most states, someone always had to be the bad guy. Someone always had to be the one at fault for a divorce to be approved. But California was the first state to enact no fault divorce. And so you had all these unhappy marriages in the 1950s and the 1960s, but the laws were very rigid and it was hard to divorce. Once the laws were changed, it was like a dam breaking. You had all this pent up demand for divorce, and then those couples that were unhappy divorced. You also, by the 70s, had, because of the women's movement, you had the growth of women in college that then became professionals. Again, working class and poor women always had to work, but you had college educated women by the 70s, middle class women by the 70s, that now had the opportunity to go into the labor force. And this was important too because now they were making their own money. They were more financially independent and they could leave unhappy marriages. They could leave abusive marriages. They could leave domestic violence more easily. And so you had growth in divorce rates for that reason too. Since the 1980s, it's important to note that divorce rates have fallen dramatically by about 30%, in fact. The reason for the divorce rates, that divorce rates have fallen, is that you have fewer people getting married in the first place, okay? And then for the people who are getting married, you have a delay in the age at first marriage. So the age at first marriage is now around 30 years of age. In the 1950s, the age at first marriage was around 20. So a lot of the women in this, especially women, because they always got married younger, a lot of the women in this class would have been married at this time if you were living in the 50s. So with the delay of marriage until you're about 30 now, you're more mature, you're more emotionally mature, you have more money, right? You're more settled. You know more about what you want. Your personality has better developed. You experience a level of independence first, and this helps to make you have more self-realization. And then if you're more mature, have more of the self-realization, have more income, have more education, you're better able to make better decisions. And so this is why divorce rates are lower amongst people who get married at an older age. So if you get married after the age of 30, you only have a 20% likelihood of getting divorced. So 20% of marriages 20% of marriages end in divorce if those marriages occur after the age of 30. 50% of marriages end up in divorce if that marriage occurs at the age of 20. So you see this significant divide. Okay, you see this significant divide in early marriage versus marriage more later in life. Feminist rethinking of the family is also important. Feminist theories suggest gender roles are learned in the family, that the family can be a battleground for power over decisions about chores, housing, raising children, spending money, and so on. And all the research shows that more egalitarian marriages tend to be more stable marriages and happier marriages. So the feminist movement has had, in many ways, a positive impact on marriage in the sense that women are much more happy today than they were in the 50s and 60s when they are married. They have more a sense of autonomy. They have more, because they're more also likely to be working. They have more income, more money. That leads to more power in the house as far as influence in decision making over important decisions. They're more likely to share household tasks with their husbands, including childcare, including cooking, including cleaning. And again, the best evidence shows that the egalitarian family structure leads to better outcomes for marriages in terms of them not ending in divorce, and better outcomes for children too. Children learn to treat women with respect in these or more egalitarian forms of marriage. Friedan, which is Betty Friedan, who we talked about in the gender unit and who's talked about in this unit as well, discussed that. She discussed the unhappiness of many middle class married women in the 50s and 60s, how they really didn't have much autonomy, they didn't have much say over financial or household decisions, and how that has shifted to now, where women have more power in marriages today. Jennifer Senior talks about how men are improving. We have what are called time use studies. So the multinational time use study showed that in 1965, men on average spent only 16 minutes a day with their children, compared to 59 minutes a day in 2012. And this maybe isn't a surprise for you as you see men kind of stepping up and being more involved with their kids. Fathers are more likely to read to their children today. They're more likely to play with them, to play games inside or outside. They're more likely to help their children with homework than they were in the 50s and 60s. Now, if you've watched any of those old movies or television shows from the 50s and 60s, a lot of it is fake, but some of it is actually somewhat true. If you remember these movies from the 50s and 60s, Dad would get home from work, he would maybe say hi to his kids, but then he'd be off in his lounge or den smoking and reading the newspaper, right? Or reading the sports section, or downstairs working with his tools. Men have really stepped it up as far as spending time with their children. Moms still spend more time with their children. Moms in 2012 spent an average of 104 minutes per day with their kids, which was twice as much as what they spent in 1965. Okay, so both moms and dads are actually spending more time with their kids today than they were in the 50s and 60s. Back in the 50s and 60s, kids were much more likely to just do kid-oriented things, go outdoors and play ball. Now, the parents are spending more time with them, with homework, with reading to them. And so that has led to educational improvements, of course, with their family members. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that. There's a few more slides that talk about inequality in American families as far as racial, ethnic backgrounds. I'm going to just have you read the textbook on those. I might come back and to discuss that in another PowerPoint lecture, but right now I'm going to have to leave it at that. So let me know if you have any questions for me.